Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
As we said last week, we are jumping into the story of Elijah. And we're not going to read the text. There's just a lot of text that we're going to be potentially covering this morning, this episode. We're going to talk about verses 1 through 16. I'm going to do a quick overview of kind of what happens, and then we'll go back through and process just some of the things we saw. A couple things to know about this. So I'm in 1 Kings 17, beginning of verse 1. First time we've met Elijah. Based on the timelines I looked at, he's in his mid-20s, which I think is interesting because I've always perceived him kind of as an old man. But he's in his mid-20s, and he shows up with this huge declaration, and I think a risky declaration, that he says that there will be no rain. And he says this to a king who's been in power for a while, King Ahab, and he says, hey, there's not going to be any rain for the next few years. And then he leaves, which makes sense, partially because if I was him, I'd be like, that's a pretty bold prediction, to predict I'm controlling the weather here.
Yeah, and then God's like, you probably want to go somewhere else. And I'm going to set you up here. I'm going to make sure you're okay. I'm going to make sure you have water and food, and I'm going to provide for you. And then God calls Elijah away after his water source dries up, and he encounters this woman.
Yeah, and this woman, she's experiencing this, obviously it'd be a drought, and I guess famine level, implications because of this functional curse that Elijah has declared. And so God directs him very specifically to this one widow. And when he gets there, he's like wanting some food, and she's like, look, we don't have anything. And we're down to the last of it. And he basically says, look, God has told me that if you feed me, if you take care of me, your oil and your flour will last miraculously, is the assumption. And that's exactly what happened. She went and did what he said, and the jar of flour, I'm in verse 16 now, was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken. So the whole thing is kind of an introduction. We don't get much of a character introduction, simply this guy is in I was going to say cahoots. That's the word. I've said that word a long time. He's connected with God, and there's real power. You don't get any big introduction. It's just like, here he is.
Cahoots with God definitely sounds like a youth group game that somebody would have come up in 2008.
That I wouldn't want to play.
So but you would have forced those teenagers to play.
I would have.
So just to kind of reiterate, this will be the last time maybe last time for a little bit, we kind of talk about the process, but we're not going to do direct Amazed and Perplexed, but we're just going to kind of take that spirit and try to process through this. So the first thing that has kind of really stuck out at me, and again, there's not directly a narrative break where we're stopping in 16, but you were just finishing up that explanation, and I was struck by how there at the beginning of the first bit that we see Elijah is, I don't know if anti-miracle, I don't know if anti-miracle is the right word, but there's this horrific drought that's taking place, and it seems like God is causing it, and then it is, for me, there's this parallel now with God is providing supernaturally, and I don't know what to do with that. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit here, but yeah, I'm just noticing the parallel there.
Yeah, that is interesting. Where it hits me is everybody else. I mean, this is not an isolated, from what we can tell, this isn't an isolated drought just for King Ahab's house. Mm-hmm. It's for the whole nation, for the whole area. And it makes me wonder, what does God expect of their people when they have wicked leadership? Yeah. Now this is different than today's leadership, than our American president, to the extent that the king dynamic, obviously it was demanded by the people way back with King Saul. But God gave it to him. He said, hey, Samuel was like, I ain't giving it to him. And he's like, no, give him the king they want, and the king is going to be very exacting, and it's going to be tough, and it's going to be trouble. And the people are like, yeah, give it to us, That's like me eating at Taco Bell. It's going to cause all this trouble, but I'm like, nah, I want what I want when I want it, you know? So anyway.
And that's never worked out poorly for you.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so here we are generations later and the people are still.
I would love to see you use that illustration in front of a bunch of old ladies.
There you go. I'll work on it. But, you know, this is reaping what they've sown. And they have this king that's very wicked. And, you know, he's been in power, I don't know, 4 or 5 years at this point. And God's like, I'm bringing this judgment. And he uses Elijah. It's fascinating to me on a storytelling perspective because God could have shared so many details. He could have started with Elijah when he was 10 and 15 and 22 and, you know, built up to this time. But it's just like, bam, he's on the scene. So it just makes me ask myself, what could the people have done to avoid this, you know, famine, to avoid this, you know, anti-miracle, as you say, you know?
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating because, like, just my modern sensibilities, and I'm not saying this is right, but I feel like it's right. So right before this, in chapter 16, it will talk about why God saw Ahab as like a bad king, and there are legitimately bad reasons. But I just to be completely honest and perfect, not honest and perfect, to be completely honest and clear. One of those reasons is not that Ahab caused. I mean, his actions, perhaps God does it, but Ahab does not directly decide to have a drought in the land and have it affect and ultimately probably kill and certainly hurt lots and lots of people. And so, yeah, that is just one of those conflicts. And we can talk maybe bigger picture about how we view these things in the Old Testament. But I think it would be dishonest to not bring that up, to go like, hey, man, this is just like, yeah, this is the consequence. The drought is part of the consequence of the idol worship and being a terrible king. But you also go like, what's worse? Like, what do I honestly in my heart feel like is worse? You know, the causing of a drought or idol worship, and how those two play together. Again, we're not going to come to like a firm 100% answer, but I think just to be genuine and honest, it's one of these passages and one of these things that just continues to not sit well with my soul, which is maybe a good reason why we chose Elijah, because then there's another part later in the story of Elijah that does not sit well with my soul. And so processing through that will be interesting. I
think that's really good. Yeah, if this was happening today, and I'm not picking on our particular president, I'm simply saying if the president does something that's very displeasing to God, and he says, okay, we're going to do famine throughout the land, my personal response would be, well, that's not, I didn't vote for that guy. I didn't want him. You know, what am I supposed to do? Like, start a revolt? Am I supposed to, you know, shed blood? Am I supposed to storm the Capitol?
Yeah.
like,
oh, gosh.
Like, what am I supposed to do?
And even still in that, like, you and I and adults listening still have more sway over what the government is doing than these people that were affected by the drought would be having with the king.
Yeah, right. They didn't vote him into office.
Yeah, not even their neighbor didn't vote him into office. You know, there wasn't like at least if, you know, hypothetical president of like a TV show in 2040 does something horrific, you'd be like, well, 50% of the country kind of asked for it, or, you know, that would
That's
not,
exactly
I wouldn't
right.
believe
Yeah.
that, but you could at least, well, maybe they're kind of getting what they're sowing, what they're reaping what they're sowing. But like the responsibility of the people. And again, now that I'm saying that out loud, there has been a pattern of the people generally turning away from God. Like it at least from my reading of the Old Testament, there's a lot of it being led by leaders, but there does seem to still be an active participation by the people of God.
And that's a really good point. There does seem to be a pattern that as the king goes, the people go. You know, when the king is holy, when the king wants God, and by holy I don't mean perfect. I mean, there's not one that you're like, oh, that king was fantastic. You know, all of them. We've spoken of David many, many times in other recordings. Man, morally and, you know, just their political power, the way they use it is not fantastic. But if they have a heart for God, if they have a desire for God at all, there's huge blessing on the country, and usually the country is in kind. So I think it is harder to make the contrast. It's harder for me to feel it. I can know it. The contrast between today, where we vote for people, but if the president is a Protestant Catholic, if they atheist, it doesn't really affect me directly in the same way that it seems their kings did, because it was such a different pathway. So that does give me a little better sense of what does God expect, you know, of the people.
Yeah. So I'm wondering here, the question that's just popping to my mind is, this is always a question that pops in my mind when I see something in the Bible, or more specifically in the Old Testament, that makes me kind of maybe like shrivel kind of a little bit kind of inside myself, and want to avoid the question is like, does this seem like something Jesus would do? Like, right, Jesus is the perfect embodiment. He's like the ultimate representation of God. Like, he is God, and if God is going to act on earth like that, like he is the perfect example of what we can expect God to be doing. And so, like, does this, and I get this is kind of a microcosm of a bigger question. Like, for me, this is always something I've struggled with. This doesn't seem like something that you would see Jesus doing. Now, there's a lot of qualifications, and there's a lot of ways that you can approach it, and there are ways that I certainly feel better about it and how I reconcile the text. But like, I feel like you do have to be like, this is not a passage you can just look over and just be like, and easily be like, well, different times, God got happy in the New Testament. You have to really come to grips with what you think here. You have to decide, are my modern sensibilities off here? Do I completely trust the reporting of the text exactly how it happened, that when the author is speaking as God, that is happening, that it's not just an interpretation? Like, so there's so many different aspects. And I think the thing that I want to just be honest and forthright with is that it's not something as Christians, as followers of Jesus believed these things. He honored these texts. And so how do we reconcile them? And I don't think there's anybody in the sound of my voice that would be like, yeah, cool, God caused a drought, and so we have to do something with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's interesting too is it's not like God's hiding from this. He directs Elijah. He could have kept that brook with water. He could have kept the ravens coming with food. It's funny because on one hand, it's like the brook dried up, which we would say, oh yeah, that's a natural effect of when you have a drought, But he's already miraculously making birds bring him food, and so he could easily miraculously keep the brook going, but he dries that up, or allows it to be dried up, to set the stage for him to send Elijah. Maybe because Elijah, and we'll see this as the story unfolds in the coming weeks, but maybe because Elijah, he needs that cause and effect. Mm-hmm. He's not just like, hey, it's perfect here, let's go someplace else. Maybe he needed Elijah to stress a little bit about it as he sees the brook drying up. He's like, no, but either way, he directs him to this woman. And according to verse 12, she's like, I can't help you because I'm just gathering a few sticks to take home, make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. So it's like God's not hiding from this reality that he created to open the eyes of the people, open the eyes of Ahab, maybe lead to repentance. I'm talking about hopefully. I'm not talking about what actually happens, because he's not doing this for no reason.
Yeah.
He's doing it for a reason. And I can, not that I need to justify it, but based on what you're saying, which I agree with, trying to figure out, how do you make this loving? Just another framing of what Jesus does. How do you make this a loving act? And just recognize God didn't have to point out people were dying, or at least anticipating death. He leads Elijah there, then does another miracle, or two miracles, if you want to put one for the oil and one for the flour. But plus, where are they getting water? I mean, they don't even bring up that, but clearly that's the anticipation.
Yeah, and I think this is something we'll track throughout the story of Elijah. Is God? One, I think it's so important you brought up the fact that God is not hiding from this reality that he is helping enact, and he is not trying to minimize the details. He's not trying to hide the consequences and the ramifications of what is going on here. Then also later on in Elijah's story, you will see God putting Elijah in circumstances where the odds are pressed against him. And so this is not a declarative statement over every time God acts, but there does seem to be, I think there's undoubtedly a aspect of when we, like, this is just therapy 101, like, we will not move until it's too painful not to move. And so, like, there's part of it that goes here that you wonder, like, the people, they had gotten so in a rut, and they had this long line of kings that were, especially in the northern kingdom in Israel, that were just despicable and evil and had turned away from their God. again, like that's part of the way I feel, and not justify, but feel some harmony with the text, realizing that in my own life, unless things get really painful, I will always stick with the status quo. And for all we know, and there were prophets that came before Elijah, God often tried to. We don't know the depths and the levels before this happened that God tried to move his people away from their idolatry and away from their idolatrous worship.
Yeah, and I think that is really true. I often think, okay, here's how a story ended up in the Bible in general, and we've even covered some of those. What if the people involved had chosen faith early on, that they hadn't needed that, the way I've heard it say, the pain of staying the same has to be greater than the pain of change for you to actually engage in that new behavior, a new path. And I wonder if when Ahab does what he does in the previous chapter, that if there would have even been an outcry, if God had been like, okay, I got my people, because the thing about God that I think is interesting, and I noticed it especially over the last, 40, 50 years of our country, there's kind of an assumption if God's kingdom is to come, then Christian people need to take power. Like we need to be in charge, because look what happens when we're not in charge. Prayer leaves the school, and this, that, other happens. And I think God is not at all interested in being in charge in the way we think. I mean, I think, well, I know that's true. And I go back even to I think the parable of the wheat and the weeds that we covered several weeks ago about, God creates this world and the enemy comes and sows, and they're like, hey, let's go do some weeding. And he's like, no, let's not. And they're like, I don't know if you've ever had a garden before, but this is how this works. He's like, no, leave the weeds. This is leaving the weeds, And I think that's really important to recognize is God's issue here isn't I'm not in charge and I'm going to lead a revolt. God's issue is my people's hearts have turned from me and I want to wake them up. Yeah. Now the death piece of that is very challenging to us because we're like, well, what happens to the person that is, and I think this now, what happens to the person that maybe used to be impassioned towards God, or at least a true believer, and then they just let it coast, and they're not really paying attention anymore, and then they die. What happens then? What's the threshold for salvation? If you really believed in Jesus, 20 years ago, and you've never said you don't, but you just kind of drift, which I think that's probably the majority of this culture too. I don't think the majority are coming and, celebrating Baal. I mean, there's a big number. We find that out in coming chapters, but not the majority of people. I think they're just, whatever. They're just apathetic. And I think it's the wake-up call to them, honestly, more than to Ahab. And it doesn't take much. Well, I don't want to take anything away from the big things that are coming, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not a, it's like an event, that happens that the vast majority are like, oh, we praise Jehovah again. You know what I mean? So it's one of these things that what is God really after here? And I think that's consistent. He's after the hearts of his people.
Yeah, no, that's really good. There's so much conversation to be had there. I'm sure we could talk about it for another 5 hours or so. But just kind of moving on to another thing, just for time's sake, I find it utterly fascinating the pair, like, again, this, I think so much of the Bible is repetition and rhyming and parallels of what had come before. But even just, you see God has this overarching drought that takes place over the land, and it's just this massive cataclysmic movement event. And then you have God working in the minute details of like, hey, I'm going to send a raven to bring you food. And that is just so, I just wonder what was going on in the mind of Elijah to be this instrument, to be somebody probably around my age, maybe a little bit younger, going through this, having God revealed to you. You are then now prophesy. You are now like directly going against the king of your country, and you are part of this, the mouthpiece for this new crazy earth-shaking new thing that God is doing here. And then now God is with you, and he's organizing to make sure that birds are bringing you food. Also, you kind of wonder, like, was it good food? Was it bad food? No, but I do find that when you think about what is to come for Elijah, like how much of this and again, I think God is always doing a million different things, but for specifically Elijah, I have to feel the fact that these things happen back to back is trying to communicate something to us about how one, got the reality of who God is, and two, how Elijah is beginning to know and be grown by God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think something interesting that pops up there, I was thinking about the whole dynamic of the food delivery system, and I'm going to go ahead and assume it's not how they feed their babies, because I know just enough about that for that to be terribly disgusting. But it is interesting that bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and it causes me to think, often when I ask the question, hey, is God really noticing me? Is he really working in my life? And I'll have all these blessings around me, but I'll lack this one thing. And I'm like, no matter how good the bread and meat was, there's no indication he's bringing him a variety of bread and meat. Mm-hmm. And I know meat at times was scarce in this culture, so maybe that was seen as an indulgence and a special. And obviously, from a dietary, you're getting your carb and your protein piece at least. There's no vegetables on the table here unless he's eating, I don't know, some kind of plants around him. But it's that idea of, because we see this tagged as God's command and God's blessing and Elijah's God's man, we don't question that. But in my life, when my world is surrounded by drought spiritually, I feel if I'm getting blessing, then I feel intention. How can a good God not ... Or I do start complaining about what I get. Really? Meat and bread again, like back to the Israelites with the quail and the manna. It's interesting how we mark. I think if you hear in today's culture, and this is certainly true in the health and wealth gospel, meaning, you follow me and I'll bless you with all kinds of material things. But I think in general, if we knew, hey, there's a person that all they've eaten for a few years is bread and meat, and they only had a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the evening, wouldn't be like, boy, that guy's really blessed by God. We think, I wonder what God's doing there. Or maybe you should come to church and, that kind of thing. And so it's interesting how I just accept this as, well, yeah, this is a good signal. But in any other setting, I'd be like, first of all, it's totally weird, and that's not trustworthy, trusting birds to bring you food. And then second of all, I'd be like, well, that's pretty bare minimum. That's bread and meat, it's not much. And so, and I'm not denying the miracle of it. I'm just saying, even within the miracle, it doesn't seem like there's this overabundant feel to it.
No, that's good. And so you get into the timeline of like, he says, makes his declaration towards Ahab, and then God's like, get out of there, go here. And you just get this rapid turn of events. And then you go into God telling him to leave, and he meets up with the widow. And the widow, basically, God directs it so that Elijah meets this widow at just the right time. You had mentioned, she says like, hey, I'm going to make this bread so we can, my son and I can lay down and die. And the timing of it is just fascinating, and kind of trying to figure out in your mind, what is God trying to tell us, and what is he trying to teach Elijah and show Elijah with the timing of it all? Like Elijah had he had been doing what he'd been doing for a long time, and yet God, in his wisdom, decides to not move Elijah to meet this widow until she is at death's door, or till she's about to give up. And so like what that has to say about God's timing and how we're supposed to interact with it, I have no idea.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting, the passage in James where it talks about, hey, you should pray. Think about Elijah. And I'm like, okay. And it referenced to, he prayed and there was no rain. He prayed, there is rain. And I'm like, okay, so how much do I internalize that? How much do I say, man, this nation's going in the wrong direction? And I'm not talking about even America. I'm saying wherever you live, this place is going in the wrong direction. So I'm going to go make a declaration. Well, to be clear, God told Elijah to say that. So wait for that, I would say. But in general, like, how much do I engage in these areas that I don't consider, I'll say it this way, conventional God areas, churches and situations, communities, where it goes over to government. I know some people would take that and say, yeah, that means we need to be incredibly active in government, maybe even hold, offices, but at the very least be incredibly active in voting and lobbying and these kind of things. And others would say, well, that's not really our affair at all, And so I don't think this gives us a clear indication either way. So yeah, I'm with you. There's probably just as many questions as I have answers, certainly. It just stirs that thinking again for me.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think we should maybe also, just before we kind of wrap up here, touch on how Elijah interacts with this woman, and how she reacts to him and his command. How she reacts to his commands to feed him, and also how she reacts to the unknown command or the unknown direction that God has given Elijah, that she will provide him food, and she will take care of him. So yeah, there's just a lot there before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think so. It's fascinating. He tells Elijah beforehand, hey, I have directed a widow there to supply you. So what does that look like? And I think about this, like when God says, hey, I want you to go love everyone. And you go and you're like, I tried my best to love this person. And the response was, shut up, or I don't need you, or get out of here, And how Elijah was just really confident. And even so much, so she just said, I was going to make bread, and that was going to be it, and we were going to die. He's like, yeah, I'm telling you, you can trust me with this. Make the bread and give it to me. So now, if there's no God intervention, she's now still going to die, but now die totally hungry, And so he's like, yeah, take the last of what you have. And so she's got a choice there. Do I trust this guy? And I think it's pretty amazing. I think it's always amazing when somebody trusts the unseen over the seen.
Yeah, and you have to commend. And again, it's not a competition, but you look at the faith of Elijah, and you look at the faith of this widow, and you go, man, the widow for me takes so much more courage to and again, she doesn't have direct faith, because she calls it like your God. She doesn't have direct faith in Yahweh, but her faith and her like acceptance for going that takes more. I don't know if guts is the right word. Than, like Elijah has God directly speaking to him, which again, that doesn't mean that throughout we know that doesn't mean that the person who hears God speaks is immediately going to do exactly what he does. But it's a little bit easier probably than the situation that this widow is put into. And so you have this really cool scenario, right? Where you have this woman who, from what I can understand of the text, doesn't, from the way that she words, the way she talks about, Elijah's God, Elijah's Lord, she doesn't directly, she doesn't subscribe to the whole Yahweh thing. And so you have this woman who is an idolater, who is not part of the in crowd, and yet God wants to use her. And even when she's still skeptical, God is still using her, and she's still able to serve this really cool purpose. Some would even say reckless purpose.
Right, yeah. Hey, I do want to clean something up. He doesn't ask for all of her bread. He says, give me part of your bread.
Small loaf, yeah.
So she's not going to die fully hungry, just less fulfilled
that feels worse to me. I feel it's an all or nothing sort of thing.
Yeah, I think in general, this whole text, to me, and I mean, I'm eager in my own mind and then the next thing and the next thing that's going to happen, but just pausing here, number one, it makes me really grateful that I live in the era I do with Jesus. There's so much more clarity. I think we think that people of faith, no matter what era they lived in, that means they just knew what to do next, and they were always wise and always had the best behavior. And the Old Testament in particular screams, not true, not true. We're living in a really weedy world, that all of us are stumbling. And the operative dynamic here is, do you trust God? Mm-hmm. Not are you doing good with God? Not what did you do yesterday, but do you right now trust God? Even if you're like, I don't even know how this would work. So on some level, certainly Elijah just trusted God.
That's good.
And the same for the woman. The woman just like, okay, I'm going to trust God. And it might be the most baseline. And I always go to Hebrews 11. What is that? Hebrews 11:6, where it says, Hebrews 1 or 11:1 is like, faith is being certain of what you don't see. And it's like, wow, that's a tall order. But then you get to like 11, maybe it's 11:7, and he goes, faith is believing that God exists, and he rewards those who seek him. And I'm like, well, that's pretty low. That's like a really low threshold there. Uh-huh. But you understand, wait, that's what he's saying in verse 1, is this idea, it is hard to believe at times there is a God. It is hard to believe he'll reward you, because it can seem really egocentric. Why would you think, Elijah, that he would reward you and not everybody else, that he would make everybody else? And yet he's like, here's what I understood him to have said, and so I'm believing it, and I'm going to assume he'll correct me as we go.
That's good. And I think for me, this just popped in my mind when you were talking. I think it's important to remind, like right now, life is, we live in a really, like I said, a great time to live. But there are lots of people around the world, and even in our city, that would consider themselves in the middle of a drought. They're in a situation that is not their fault necessarily, and the world, circumstances, whatever it may be, has put an enormous weight of bad health, of of social stigma or whatever the thing may be. Like there are people that we deal with every day that would either consider themselves or we would all consider to be in a metaphorical drought. And I even think about what happened recently in Turkey and Syria with the earthquakes and like I am very confident that there are people of God who died in that horrific event, and there are people who are deeply affected close by who are dealing with this right now. And I think it's just for me, it's so easy to be academic about it, about in the past of how do you deal with this, but recognizing there are droughts here and now, and I know that there are people in Turkey who are faithful, who are I don't understand, I don't get it, God, but like I'm going to choose to be faithful here and now, and I think that's the important part. It's not the answer for everything or every hard question, but it's like, okay, if I believe God, if I believe Jesus is the Son of God, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to grapple with it? Yeah, I can wrestle. I can use different ways of reasoning or philosophy or hermeneutic or just whatever it may be. But ultimately, it all comes back down to this of like, okay, do I believe God is who He says He is? Then I've just got to trust. I've got to trust in this moment and believe that He wants the best for me, that He is for me, and that He is going to work this all for good.
Next week, we're going to be looking at 1 Kings 17, verses 17 through 24. Just encourage you to take a few minutes to read that beforehand. And as we always would love, if you have a thought, if you have a question, if you have a correction, we do really want to hear from you. And so feel free to let us know in whatever form that would be most easiest for you.
Smoke signal.
Actually, that's what we prefer. And so, just really excited about how this affects me today and how my thinking will be adjusted from it, and pray that it's been a blessing to you as well.
Yeah. Grace, peace, and love.